Welcome back to Required Reading, where we continue our reading of Ghostbusters: The Return, Chapter 6. "I'm telling you," Ray said, "there's something going on." "Why?" Egon replied dryly. "Just because in the last 72 hours we've had to deal with 12 free-floating vapors, 6 Class 4 poltergeists, 8 full-body apparitions, and a swarm of ectoplasmic urban legend alligators that I'm still not sure how to classify?" "No, it's more than that. You have to consider the forms they've been manifesting too. Sewer gators, kidney thieves, hook-handed killers. Heck, we had 3 vanishing hitchhikers this morning alone. When's the last time that happened?" "So you're saying that they're all connected?" "They have to be, don't you think?" Egon nodded. "I'd say so. As coincidences go, I'd place the probability of this happening by chance as just slightly less than all of the plankton on Earth suddenly jumping up and singing, 'Hello, Dolly.'" "Which would make it slightly more likely than plankton jumping up to sing 'Ice, Ice, Baby.'" "Why do you say that?" "Even plankton have some taste." Egon smiled at that. Ray always took it as a personal triumph when one of his jokes made Egon smile. It was the closest Egon ever came to laughing out loud. "Someone's bringing urban legends to life," said Ray. "We're not going to be able to stop this for good until we figure out who and why." "You're probably correct," Egon agreed. "But it'll have to wait until Peter and Winston return from their meeting and we're back to full strength. For now, I think we'd better table the discussion and turn our attention to the matter at hand." "Right." Throughout the conversation, the pair had been slowly inching up towards a 4-foot potted cactus, their neutrino wands held loosely but ready. Large potted plants were not uncommon along the streets of New York, but this one was different. Ordinarily, it would have been strange enough that this particular plant stood in the middle of the street, or that both the cactus and its pot were a pale, chalky white, or that the afternoon sun shone partially through it, rendering the cactus translucent. But in this case, all of those considerations were overshadowed by the thing that was even more unusual. The cactus was moving. It wasn't that it was floating or walking around or anything like that. It wasn't even jumping up to sing "Hello, Dolly." But it was pulsing and bulging in various places, with an organic motion that made it seem alive. Ray and Egon stopped walking and maintained a respectful distance of about 3 feet from the spectral cactus. Egon shifted his neutrino wand to one hand and took out his PKE meter with the other. He waved it slowly in front of the cactus, moving it up and down, then side to side, as he scanned the plant for supernatural energies. Not surprisingly, the readout on the meter was going through the roof. "Readings in the red zone?" Ray asked. "Infrared," Egon said. "And here we are short-handed." "Apparently, Peter and Winston chose a rather inconvenient time to start moonlighting in politics." Ray edged a half-step closer to the pulsating cactus. Without taking his eyes off it, he asked, "Ever heard of dead plants leaving ghosts behind?" "Not in the last 15 centuries or so," said Egon. He was keeping an equally close eye on the cactus. "There's the legend of the deadly nightshades, but that's about it." "Sounds right. How about urban legends about cacti?" "No, but I'm not really up on the literature. I've never had much patience for things that aren't real." "Why is it moving like that?" "I'm not sure." Does it look to you as though it's starting to move faster?" It was true. The pulsations were coming fast and furious now, as though it was reaching a fever pitch. "Shoot it!" cried Ray. But before they could trigger their weapons, the cactus exploded. It burst into a spray of something that filled the air and splattered across their bodies. For a split second, the two Ghostbusters assumed it was ectoplasmic slime. Immediately, though, they both realized that it wasn't slimy, and it wasn't a single mass. The it was really a they, and they were alive. Egon looked down at his chest in alarm. "Ghost spiders!" "Thousands of them!" cried Ray. The spiders were everywhere, on the street, on the walls, and, most important, on Ray and Egon. More out of reflex than anything else, they flailed wildly, trying to swat the spiders away, but their hands simply passed harmlessly through the insubstantial bodies of the ghostly arachnids. "We can't blast them," Egon realized. As long as the spiders were swarming on their bodies, zapping them would mean zapping each other, and with weapons that could blow holes through concrete, that just didn't seem like a good idea. "They're on the clothes! Ditch 'em!" Ray shouted back. He was already stripping off his gear and coveralls, carrying the bulk of his spiders with it. He stomped on the pedal of a fallen trap and tossed his coveralls into the brilliant white light that poured out of it. In a flash, Ray's spiders were gone, and his coveralls were too. A moment later, Egon followed suit. Standing in their underwear, the pair snatched up their proton packs and looked around at the waves of spectral arachnids that seemed to be everywhere. "I wish I thought to thank my mother when she was alive," Ray muttered. "Thank her for what?" Egon asked. "For teaching me to always wear clean underwear." "Let's get to it." Egon gritted his teeth and took aim. "Where the hell are Peter and Winston?" I could get used to this, Venkman thought. He adjusted the silk necktie they'd given him, straightened the lapels on his new Armani suit, and struck his most mayoral pose. Lights flashed as the photographer snapped another picture. "Excellent," said the photographer. "Now let's get a few of the two of you together." Winston joined Venkman in front of the cameras. It was funny how different Winston looked in an expensive suit. Venkman had rarely seen him in so much as a tie. He had to admit, his fellow Ghostbuster cleaned up nicely. In Venkman's opinion, at least the two of them genuinely looked like candidates. Winston was grinning madly, like a kid on Christmas morning. "Can you believe this?" he asked. "You know me," Venkman replied. "I'll believe anything." The photographer raised a hand to catch their attention. "How about a few warm smiles? Good. Hold it." He snapped off several photos in rapid succession. Venkman fought the temptation to hold up 2 fingers behind Winston's head. "Okay, now put an arm around Mr. Zedmore's shoulders. Great, just like that." The past couple of days had been a whirlwind. With so little time to catch his breath, it all still felt like a dream to Venkman. However, even if it did turn out to be a dream, he had absolutely no intention of pinching himself to find out. "Okay, we need some more serious shots now. Let's see some confidence. Come on, you call that confidence? There you go. Excellent." Growing up as the son of a pair of carnival barkers, Venkman had never really pictured himself taking a job that meant wearing a suit every day, let alone running for office. Then again, he hadn't really imagined himself on the faculty of a major university or chasing spooks out of Madison Square Garden either, and those jobs hadn't turned out too badly. Sure, they kicked him out of the university eventually, and Ghostbusters did go bankrupt a few times. But by and large, though, it had been an incredible ride. "Good. Let's get the two of you shaking hands now. Dr. Venkman, can you move a half step to your left? That's it." Venkman wasn't really sure what his chances were in the election. Still, considering the free suits, free meals, and who knew what else he'd be picking up along the way, it looked like he'd come out of this ahead either way, regardless of whether he won or lost the election. And if by some chance he did win, well, then the fun was just beginning. Not that he'd ever try to hurt anyone. Well, maybe just that woman at the Motor Vehicles Bureau who kept sending him to the back of the line. But he had no doubt that he'd have ample opportunity to pick up a few perks along the way. After all, he'd have the New York City checkbook in his pocket and a deputy mayor who didn't know anything more about the city government than he did. And that's the last of them. Thank you, gentlemen. Venkman and Winston clapped each other on the shoulder and stepped away from the backdrop that had been erected in the conference room. A splendid morning's work, my friend, Venkman said. How about celebrating over some lunch and cocktails? Sounds good, Winston replied as they moved towards the door. But maybe we should check in with Ray and Egon first to make sure that they don't need us. Hey, they're professionals. They can handle things for a few hours. Why would they possibly need us? I guess. Can't hurt to check, though. John Fielding was waiting for them at the door. He shook his head. Sorry, fellows, not so fast. Uh-oh, Venkman thought. In his experience, the words, not so fast, were never good. For a moment, he wondered whether they'd at least let him keep the suit. You're not done for the day yet, said Fielding. Not by a long shot. Oh, is that all? Venkman thought with relief. You still need to go through your first briefing session, and then we have to start on your media training. Here. Fielding handed each of them a thick binder. At a guess, Venkman would have figured that each binder was filled with a couple 100 pages. His estimate would have been short by at least another 100. What's this? Winston asked, opening the cover to glance inside. Your platform, said Fielding. That book contains your position on every issue that's likely to arise during the election. The blue page at the front of each section is a brief on the substance of the issue. After that, you'll find your position, the positions of your various opponents. You'll want to pay particular attention to Mayor Lipinski's, of course, and your 3 or 4 key message points. Suddenly, Venkman felt himself getting nervous. This was starting to sound like work. He held up a hand in mock defense. Whoa, Johnny. Hold up a minute. Don't you think we're veering just a tad into overkill here? Fielding looked puzzled. Why's that? Venkman hefted the thick notebook. Well, this is a doorstop here. I'm sure you guys and gals in the back room put a lot of work into this. The binding alone is very attractive. You don't find this kind of black vinyl 3-ring binder just anywhere. But if all this thing does is list the candidates' opinions, then I think we can probably do without it, don't you? I am the candidate, after all. Who knows my opinion better than me? Fielding's look of puzzlement had been replaced by an eyebrow raised in skepticism. Oh, when you put it that way, I knew you'd come around. Where do you stand on the Brooklyn sewer treatment bypass legislation? Huh? The Brooklyn sewer treatment bypass legislation. You're the candidate. You must have an opinion. Well, sure, Venkman stammered. In the matter of the Brooklyn sewage treatment bypass legislation. I'd have to say that sewage plays a major role in the city of New York. And one thing's for sure, if you have sewage, you're gonna have to treat it, and treat it well. So if you want to bypass the sewage, Fielding watched Venkman with his arms crossed and a bemused smile on his face. Yeah, all right, Venkman said, deflated. I'll read the book. Thank you. Venkman flipped idly through the binder, pausing at individual pages more or less at random. But I'm not so sure about this whole business of you guys telling me what my opinions are. Over the years, I have managed to come up with 1 or 2 of my own, you know. Fielding sighed. Peter, you're a smart guy. You hold 2 PhDs, right? Right. Psychology and parapsychology. Good. Then I'm sure you can follow this. The candidate is the public face of the campaign. Right. But that's just the public face. The candidate's not a one-man show. He's representing the needs and interests of the entire party. That means that the things that come out of his mouth have to be aligned with the positions of the party. Fielding tapped his fingers on the cover of the binder. Every word in here was crafted by experts working hard behind the scenes. They understand these issues far better than you or I ever will. You will just need to trust them, okay? I suppose. Just then, Winston chimed in. Actually, he said, the sewage treatment legislation is a pretty important thing. If it passes, it runs the risk of raising toxicity levels in the water by a good 40%, not to mention the possible health risk for the children living around there. Yeah? Said Venkman. He started to flip through the binder. What page is that on? Oh, I don't know, Winston replied. I didn't read about it in there. Then how do you know about it? They were debating it last week on the city council meeting. I saw it on cable. You watch those things? Absolutely. Don't you? Peter, those guys on the city council are making decisions that affect all of us. It just makes sense to stay on top of it, Winston said. Like the whole budget fiasco in the transit authority a few months back. Now that was a mess. Money being mismanaged left and right. I'll tell you guys, if I'd been there, I'd been all over those guys. Fielding nodded in appreciation. That's very impressive, Winston. More and more I can see that we made the right choice bringing you onto this ticket. Thank you, sir. We're all going to be working together closely for the next months. You can call me John. Thanks, John. Now, the good news is that you two are big news. The press has been clamoring for interviews, said Fielding. We need to keep that heat going, so we've scheduled a full slate of interviews for you tomorrow. What's the bad news? Winston asked. You need to be ready by then. That means media training today, and it means, Fielding tapped the hefty binder in Venkman's hands, you have to get through all of this by tomorrow. I wouldn't count on any of us going home early tonight. As Fielding and Winston continued to talk, Venkman stared at his running mate in disbelief. Money was being mismanaged left and right? I'd have been all over those guys? What happened to Winston? Since when did he know all about this stuff? Or could it be that Winston had been interested in these sorts of things all along, and Venkman just never noticed? It wasn't as though he'd spent a whole lot of time pondering Winston's political views or the way Winston spent his spare time. Either way, the most likely result was a serious crimp in Venkman's style. He wondered if there might be a way to turn things around. Maybe Ray would make a more clueless deputy mayor. But no, it was too late for that. He'd already publicly announced Winston as his running mate. Besides, he liked Winston. This all seemed to mean so much to the guy. Much as it might make his life easier, he just couldn't pull the rug out from under him. None of which meant that Venkman had to give up his plans, of course. It just added a complication that he would have to work around. It was the price of friendship, he supposed with a sigh. Venkman watched Winston and Fielding paging through the binder. Winston was saying something about school reform and fiscal responsibility. Friends are a pain, Venkman thought. It's good to have friends, Winston thought. He knew full well that he wouldn't be standing here in a fancy suit if it weren't for Venkman. Peter was the golden boy, who was the party's first choice. More and more, though, it seemed as though the party boys considered Winston to be an asset, too, and that felt pretty good. Either way, though, he didn't mind tagging along for the ride. Actually, it was an attitude that had served Winston fairly well throughout his adult life. Growing up on the streets of Brooklyn, he never really imagined himself running for office, or even chasing ghosts, for that matter. With Winston's father working construction, the Zedmores hadn't had the kind of money or middle-class lifestyles that folks like Ray or Egon had grown up with. It was Winston's mother who had encouraged him to go into the service after high school so that he could get a decent education on the government's tab. Sure enough, a few years later, he came out of the military with certification in electrical engineering, not to mention small arms training, a black belt in karate, and a stint in the Strategic Air Command ECM school. With the military behind him, Winston fully expected to put his engineering background to work when he came home. What he didn't expect was to find the economy in what the president was referring to as a downturn. With hardly a job to be had, Winston's father's connections helped him land the occasional construction job, but even those were few and far between, and there was only so long that he could live off Mama Zedmore. He started off searching the want ads each day for electrical engineering jobs, but after a while, he was searching for any job at all. So when he saw the ad for an ectoplasmic containment specialist, he had no idea what the job might be, but he figured he had nothing to lose. Whatever it was, they were looking for candidates with weapons training and either military or law enforcement experience. He had plenty of military experience, all right. It was probably some kind of security job, he guessed. Even today, he still smiled at the memory of what passed for his job interview. The whole thing had consisted basically of Janine asking him one question. Do you believe in UFOs, astral projection, mental telepathy, ESP, clairvoyance, spirit photography, full trance medium, psychokinetic or telekinetic movements, cartomancy, pharaohology, black and or white magic, divination, scrying, necromancy, and the Theory of Atlantis, the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, the Bermuda Triangle, are in general spooks, specters, wraiths, geists, and ghosts? Winston's answer had been a simple one. If there's a steady paycheck in it, I'll believe anything you say. A few minutes later, Ray, Egon, and Peter had come swooping back into the office. Business was booming, and they were up to their ears in phantoms. Before Winston could say so much as a word, Ray told him he was hired. From then on, his life became a mad rush of ghoulies, ghosties, and things that went bump in the night. Winston never expected to spend the next several years doing what his mother affectionately referred to as running around with a bunch of white boys hunting spirits. A religious woman, she was always just a little uncomfortable with what he did for a living, despite his repeated assurances that his employers were scientists, not black magicians. Still, her discomfort didn't stop her from cutting out every news item that mentioned him and pasting it into a scrapbook about her son, the Ghostbuster. By this point, she was up to her third book. When Winston called to tell her about the latest little twist in his career path, though, his mother's reaction was a whole different ballgame. She hadn't believed him at first, of course. Deputy mayor. She thought he was pulling her leg. And to tell the truth, he couldn't blame her. He was having a hard time believing it himself. Once she realized that he was telling the truth, though, she was fit to be bussed. She was so overwhelmed that he had to hold the telephone receiver away from his ear to avoid going deaf from excited shrieks. Her own son, possibly the next deputy mayor of New York? She couldn't get off the phone fast enough so that she could call every single relative, living and dead, and then run up and down the block to tell the neighbors. Winston hadn't stopped grinning since then. He had always known that his mama was proud of him, but now he finally felt like he was living up to it. That was why he was determined to make sure that he and Venkman won the election. It wasn't for the fame, which he suspected was part of Peter's reason for doing it. Winston's primary motivation wasn't even to help people and make a difference, although that was certainly a big piece of it. No, the main reason he wanted to win the election was that he didn't want to let his mother down. By the time Dr. Venkman, candidate for the office of mayor of New York, got home that night, he was beat. It was well after 10 o'clock when he stepped out of a taxi in front of his apartment building. He was used to late nights. In fact, he was far more of a night person than a morning person. But tonight, his brain was suffering from information overload. After a day of photo shoots, briefings, and media trainings, his head was swimming with facts and opinions about public utilities, tax rebates, and garbage strikes. All he wanted to do now was take a hot shower, leave a couple more apologies on Dana's answering machine, and hit the sheets. I sure do know how to live, he told himself. Venkman stood there on the sidewalk for a moment. He moved his head around in a circle and rolled his shoulders a few times, trying to loosen up the tension in his neck. It helped a little. Feeling a bit better, he took out his keys and let himself into the building. Once inside, he paused to open his mailbox. He pulled out a handful of envelopes and flipped through them as he climbed the stairs to his apartment. Bill, junk mail, junk. Fabulous offer to win big. Bill. The long day made the flights of stairs seem even more steep than usual. He wondered whether there were elevators in Gracie Mansion. There weren't all that many floors in the mayor's residence, certainly not as many as there were in the high-rise apartment buildings that so many New Yorkers lived in. But he figured that as a city-owned building, the mansion probably had to have at least one so that it could be considered wheelchair accessible. Well, if it doesn't, he decided, rounding the next landing, that's going to be my first order of business when I take office. Even in the privacy of his own thoughts, Peter Venkman always framed things in the terms of when. If just wasn't his style. At last, he climbed the last few stairs and walked to the door of his apartment. He flipped briefly through the ring of keys and slipped the appropriate one into the deadbolt lock. As the key turned, he was startled by a voice behind him. "If you're doing all of this to impress me, it's working." Venkman's eyebrows rose in surprise, and his lips curled into a smile. He turned to see Dana, standing there with a cockeyed smirk of her own. "What, this?" he said. "If you think the way I open a door is impressive, you should see me with a window." She slowly stepped closer. "I meant the whole thing with you running for mayor." He took a step toward her, meeting in the middle of the hall. "Oh, that. Guess you caught me. Yeah, it's gonna be on the front page of tomorrow's papers. Candidate runs to impress girl." "Girl?" "Okay. Candidate runs to impress independent, liberated woman with hopes, dreams, and aspirations of her own." Dana fingered the lapel of his jacket. "Nice suit." "Thanks. So, what brings you by?" "I tried calling you at the office this afternoon, but Janine said you haven't been in all day." "Yeah, election stuff. How long have you been waiting?" She glanced at her watch. "About 45 minutes or so. One of your neighbors let me in. I suppose I look honest. Not to mention really, really hot. So where's Oscar?" "Babysitter. And Butch is fine." "Well, it won't get him beaten up after school anyway." Venkman breathed a mental sigh of relief. Dana was letting him call Oscar Butch again. If she hadn't completely forgiven him yet, she was well on her way at least. "Listen, do you want to come in? It probably beats standing out here in the hall all night. I think the woman in 3G is watching us through the peephole." Venkman turned toward apartment 3G and waved. "Hi, Mrs. Tolkfolge. Be sure to tune in again tomorrow for another stirring installment of Hallways of Our Lives. Will Dana lay down her cello and take Peter back? Will Chanel survive her fateful brain surgery? And what about Naomi?" He pursed his lips and ran towards apartment 3G, planting a loud smoochy kiss right on the glass of the peephole. Once he felt fairly confident that his neighbor had recoiled from the peephole in embarrassment, he walked calmly back to his own door. Dana was giggling. He loved it when she giggled. He opened the door and ushered Dana into the apartment. With a final wave to Mrs. Tolkfolge, more for effect than anything else, he closed the door behind him. Once they were alone, he slipped his arms around Dana's waist. "So, what did bring you back?" "Who says I'm back?" "It was my raw animal magnetism, wasn't it?" Dana slipped out of his arms as smoothly as he slipped them around her. "You're right." "About my magnetism?" "No, that you're a dope." With a grunt, Venkman mimed being stabbed through the heart. Was it any wonder that he found her so attractive? Dana waited patiently until he finished staggering around in his death throes. When he was done, she asked, "Mayor, huh?" "Why not?" "I don't remember you mentioning any political aspirations before." "They developed kind of suddenly. Here, let me take your coat. Oh, and any other pieces of clothing you'd like to remove." Venkman spent the next hour filling her in on all the details over coffee. Or almost all the details, anyway. He left out the parts about scamming whatever he could get out of the job. Dana was not only an attractive audience, but an attentive one as well. She asked the occasional question, but otherwise she didn't interrupt very much. As he let the story unfold, he noticed a funny look in her eyes. She seemed unusually focused, studying his face. After a while, he couldn't ignore it any longer. "What's up?" he asked. "Do I have something stuck in my teeth?" "Hmm? Oh, no, it's nothing like that." "So what then?" "Nothing. I was just thinking." "Yeah?" "Well, you remember our conversation about responsibility?" "Yeah." "Being the mayor is a pretty big job. It brings along a lot of responsibility. Do you think you're ready for that?" To be honest, the enormity of the responsibility hadn't fully hit him until just that moment. He thought about how much work it had taken just to start to understand all the issues today. He could only imagine how much tougher it would be to have to actually deal with all of them. But then again, he figured he could give all the work to his staff. "Sure," he said. "I can handle it, no problem." She eyed him curiously. "What are you up to?" "Up to? You know, I'm deeply hurt that you just immediately assume that I'm up to something. Can't I just act out of civic-mindedness? Can't I just try to help my fellow man? Can't I just want to give something back to this crazy cockamamie city that I love?" Dana didn't say anything, but the look on her face said that she still wasn't convinced. So Venkman kept going. "Can't I try to mend my ways and win back the woman who means more to me than any election, nay, more than life itself?" Dana looked bemused. "You're so full of it." "But charming." Dana leaned back in her chair and let out a deep breath. "I don't know." "Don't worry about it. There are plenty of things I don't know about. Material dialecticism, calculus." "Why am I finding this new attitude of yours hard to believe?" "Because you're overly skeptical. It's okay. Everyone has their little character flaws." He laid his hand on hers. "But admitting it is the first step. I'm here for you. We'll get through this together." Dana barely acknowledged that he had said anything. "I've known you long enough to know that you always have an angle. However, I've also known you long enough to know that you usually do the right thing in the end. Who knows? Maybe this whole thing will be good for you." "So we're back together?" Dana looked into his eyes and smiled. "I'll think about it."